Imagine if. The Apollo program true story, or was it?
Was the Apollo mission a hoax? If the question is, how do you hide a lie? The answer is, with another lie. The Plejaren extraterrestrials who have been in contact with Billy Meier for several decades, give us details about the Apollo program. Contrary to many conspiracy theories, they tell us NASA in fact did make several successful moon landings during the Apollo mission program. However, they also confirmed that the Apollo 11 moon landing never actually happened. It was the first NASA hoax. They then tell us about how the Apollo 13 did not in fact have a failure as NASA presented to the world. It was the second NASA hoax. How was it possible to perpetrate a lie to billions of people by performing these two hoaxes? In this video, we set out to analyze a sequential timeline of events that outline all what Billy Meier and the Plejaren have told us over the years, as well as our own observations and questions about how it all could have happened. All this put together encapsulates and shapes the information you are about to receive. Our aim is to expose some facts along with some evidential factors for consideration. It is, however, very important that each and every one viewing this video think for themselves, so as to conclude if all this is possible or even probable. Maybe even true. Here is a highlight of key events in the timeline. 1. Kennedy's speech. On September 12, 1962, President Kennedy declares that the USA will reach the moon in the 1960s. 2. JFK is dead. November 22, 1963. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. 3. Apollo reached the moon. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 is the first of the Apollo missions to reach the moon, and it did it in a record time of 2 days and 20 hours. This fact will be important later. 4. A new president. January 20, 1969. Richard Nixon became President of the United States. 5. Apollo very close to land on the moon. On May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 flew to the moon. It went very close to its surface with its lunar modules, but did not land there. The mission was successful. These 5 events created the preconditions for the Apollo 11 hoax to happen. Billy Meier, in an interview done some years ago, told us that Apollo 11 did not land on the moon. This is based on conversations he had with his extraterrestrial friends, the Plejaren.
Wegen Apollo 11, da habe ich dann sowieso etwas ganz Besonderes. Die Apollo 11 Mission, das war ein Schwindel von A bis Z. Ist überhaupt nicht passiert. Die Mondlandung, der Mondflug ist nicht passiert. Das ist alles schaustellermäßig, filmmäßig ist das aufbereitet worden und nachher überspielt worden ins in Houston Zentrum, wie heißt das? Airspace Center, oder wie das heißt. Dann ist alles da überspielt worden und alle, die mitgemacht haben, sind durch diese Filme betrogen worden. Haben auch nichts davon gewusst. So ist auch die ganze Welt übers Ohr gehauen worden.
The Billy Meier interview clip you just saw, plus the information contained in the contact reports and publicly available information, informs the understanding about how we think the NASA hoax of the Apollo 11 was executed. 6. Before the liftoff of Apollo 11. It is said NASA had created a lunar simulated training site for astronauts, a replica of the lunar surface, where Apollo 11 was supposed to land. The astronauts trained in this facility whilst wearing their spacesuits and performing practice activities. In this facility, they managed to simulate the moon's low gravity by using a kind of cable that would be fastened to spacesuits, so as to create a counterweight that pulled the astronauts upwards, thus reducing their net weight sufficiently to simulate the effects of low gravity. Someone weighing 70 kilograms would be lifted by the cables with a force of 58 kilograms, which in turn would simulate a weight of only 11.6 kilograms. This is equal to the weight under the moon's gravity. With this system, they could simulate walking by performing small jumps, as they practiced in this training site. The original intention of using this training facility could have been to discover possible problems or challenges that might arise when the real walk on the moon would take place. We think that President Nixon, nervous about the possibility of America failing its first lunar landing attempt, decided to create or merely participated in a deception that would be made to appear that NASA had succeeded in landing on the moon, but without actually doing so. But what could be wrong that made the perpetrators of the first hoax so nervous? It was already tested that a lunar module could be in Moon's orbit and even get close to the Moon's surface. But there was something that was not already tested: landing. That phase of slowing down the lunar module and then landing on the moon could end up in a catastrophic failure, a crash, or maybe even the module could have tipped over. Either one would have been catastrophic landing failures, preventing the astronauts from returning to the space module and safe back to Earth. The Plejaren tell us that the group creating this fabrication was constituted by Werner von Braun, Werner's assistant, Ernst Stullinger, and a small group, in all totaling 37 people. We think Nixon was not only involved, but promoting the fraud. It is this small group of 37 people that made all the secret preparations to carry out the fraud. The Plejaren do not give us details on how the hoax operation was done. They just tell us the Apollo 11 never landed on the moon, as we heard from Billy Meier in the video clip. But it is our conclusion that the Apollo 11 astronauts must have boarded the Saturn V, actually traveled to the moon, performed several orbits around it, without landing, and then they came back. The operating words here being, without landing. You see, NASA wanted certainty, a guaranteed moon landing, but they had never done it before, and there were two major risks that could deliver an unacceptable failure. So, it is likely they thought it would be easier to simply repeat what the Apollo 10 mission had already accomplished before. Apollo 11 would set out to secretly repeat the Apollo 10 mission, without actually landing, and without anyone in the world knowing, except the group of 37. In all, the mission control staff and the world at large were unaware of the hoax, nor did any of them ever realize the Apollo 11 never actually landed. Everyone in the world witnessed the three astronauts boarding the Saturn V rocket, lifting off as they flew into space, and then sending transmissions from the moon, and then coming back in the capsule, by splash landing into the ocean. This was a global event. It is our conclusion that the Apollo 11 astronauts most likely transmitted all the audio signals from the spacecraft when it was close to the moon. They needed to make the transmission from the moon. It would have never been possible to execute the hoax without a successful flight, or by staying on Earth's surface and transmitting the signals from Earth. You see, the space module's signal was not only picked up by Houston. Due to Earth's rotation, it was necessary for NASA to collaborate with other communication stations around the Earth, so round-the-clock transmissions could be received. So, sending the transmission from Earth, through signals to Houston was not possible. Therefore, the conclusion is that Apollo 11 did in fact fly and transmit from the moon. But how did they simulate the landing? The only conclusion we can present considers a premeditated plan, where the group of 37 prepared several film recordings of the astronauts practicing during their simulated moon walks. This they could do during any of the routine exercises inside the practice facility, which had a perfect moon surface replica and a lunar module for the astronauts to execute their practice exit and entry into the lunar module and the actual lunar walks. As Billy Meier said, this group of 37 managed to record several video shots at the simulated training site, and in turn created a final video version that the Apollo 11 astronauts took with them into Saturn V. We conclude it was this fake version that simulated the last moments, when the spacecraft touched lunar soil, and other scenes in which Armstrong and Aldrin appeared descending from the lunar module to walk on the surface soil for the first time, were in fact only simulated practice runs performed in this training facility. These short scenes were not difficult to record, given the training center was a replica of the moon's surface. 7. Apollo 11 lifts off. So what and how did it happen, when on July 16, 1969, the Saturn V lifted off into space, whilst the entire world held their breath for the Apollo 11 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins? Yes, Apollo 11 is headed toward the moon, and according to our conclusions, they have with them the pre-recorded video the world heard and saw. 8. Apollo 11 landing. On July 20, 1969, the astronauts were in orbit around the moon. NASA tells us that they used the same path that Apollo 10 followed on the previous mission. The astronauts transmitted images of the moon's surface while getting closer, during the descent to the lunar surface. But at some point, during their real transmission, we conclude they swapped the feed, and we think this is when they began to transmit the pre-recorded fake moon landing and moonwalk video. In this pre-recorded video, the world watched the lunar module touch the ground, followed by the exit from the module and lunar walk, but in reality, they were orbiting the moon. The pre-recorded video was transmitted from this point on, but the audio sound of the conversations was live, since the astronauts interacted with the operators of the Houston Mission Control Center, and even they talked live with the President of the United States. The video of the astronauts going down the steps of the lunar module was transmitted whilst orbiting the moon. We saw Armstrong descending first. However, they were inside the spacecraft orbiting above the moon, not on the moon's surface. The famous phrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," was most likely declared by Armstrong from inside the spacecraft in lunar orbit, or maybe this was also pre-recorded. He was not actually standing on the lunar surface as the fake recording showed. On Earth, many people were very excited about this great event, not suspecting that it was not really happening. It was not easy to realize this deception, since the transmission came from the moon. And as we said, it was picked up by many telecom stations around the globe. Other pre-recorded scenes were transmitted during the remaining 21 hours and 36 minutes, supposedly from the lunar surface. Ultimately, the spacecraft Apollo 11, which never landed, and was making orbits around the moon, set out to return to Earth, and the astronauts were greeted as heroes. After a quarantine period, they went on a world tour, and gave as a gift, fragments of the lunar rocks they collected. It is interesting to know that one of these fragments, which is currently in the Dutch National Rijksmuseum, a museum that was exhibiting this rock, was found to be a petrified tree rock. This is an Earth rock, not from the Moon. After this, the Apollo 11 astronauts were subjected to quarantine for 3 weeks. We don't know what really happened during this time. Maybe you can extract a clue from what Billy Meier says here.
Und von all denen, die mitgemacht haben bei diesem Betrug, die sind alle durch Hypnose sind die dazu gemacht worden und haben dann falsche Erinnerungen, posthypnotische Erinnerungen und so weiter und so fort. Und die haben dann selbst daran geglaubt, dass sie das wirklich erlebt hätten. Die angeblich auf dem Mond gewesen sind. Ja, und die tragen ein Leben lang die falsche Erinnerungen in sich.
Perhaps during the quarantine period, the 3 astronauts were subjected to drug-induced hypnosis, managing to implant false memories. The astronauts' drug-induced hypnosis would cause them to remember that they were walking on the lunar surface, even though they had only done so at the training site. 9. First man on the Moon. It was November 19, 1969. This was a historic day. It was the Apollo 12 moon landing. The Plejaren do not declare this as the first moon landing, but we conclude it was, because they say Apollo 12 landed on the moon. It is the first time that a spacecraft from Earth, manned by astronauts, landed on the moon. They touched down not far from the site of the Surveyor 3 probe that had arrived a few years earlier. Conrad was the first astronaut that actually walked on the moon. As he stepped down and took the first steps, he said,
"Whoopee, man. That may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me."
We can certainly congratulate Conrad and NASA for this achievement. After this, it was more certain that landing on the moon was achievable. It is then, when the second Apollo program hoax happened.
Der zweite Betrug fand dann 1970 statt. Und zwar, soll ich das jetzt wirklich sagen, da sind sie mit der Apollo 13 sind sie 6 Tage unterwegs gewesen. Und da hat es geheißen, auch alles manipuliert und alle unter Hypnose und Drogen und so weiter. Sie hätten einen Schaden gehabt, technischer Schaden an der Kapsel, an der Raumkapsel, hat man gesagt. Und seien, ohne dass sie hätten landen können, zur Erde zurückgekehrt. Die sind zurückgekehrt und haben gesagt, sie hätten keine Mondlandung durchführen können. Haben sie gesagt, was nicht stimmt.
Then, Apollo 13 did not have an accident as they declared. Why they told us this? 10. Apollo 13 lifts off. On April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off, carrying more fuel than it needed. According to NASA, it could test the rockets for future missions where they will carry more cargo. So, why did they have more fuel? Well, it was going to very soon become clear that there was nothing left behind by Apollo 11, on the Sea of Tranquility, the area of the moon where Apollo 11 supposedly landed. It was also clear that soon in the not-so-distant future, other nations and trips to the moon, or perhaps even very powerful telescopes, would find that there was nothing there, and finding out that the Apollo 11 landing was a hoax. So, the same group of 37 that orchestrated the Apollo 11 hoax, organized the Apollo 13 hoax. What was the real secret mission of the Apollo 13? Let us watch this clip where Billy Meier talks about it.
Es war eine Schnellaktion, die durchgeführt wurde. Die sind auf dem Mond gelandet. Und zwar genau dort, wo die Apollo 11 gelandet sein soll. Um die Sachen dort niederzulegen, die angeblich liegen geblieben sind, und um Fußspuren zu machen. Und zwar in Voraussicht, dass im neuen Jahrtausend, also in dem wir jetzt leben, Amerikaner oder Chinesen oder Russen auf den Mond raufgehen und dann dort die Sachen finden und gesagt werden kann, Apollo 11 war also doch droben.
We conclude the real mission of Apollo 13 was to transport all the instruments carried on Apollo 11 and plant them on the surface of the moon, where Apollo 11 would have landed, the Sea of Tranquility. We assume Apollo 13 astronauts knew about the changes to the original plan in the real mission, but probably at the last minute, when there was no turning back. They carried more fuel than they needed. Why? Maybe what they really wanted was to speed up the rocket, with its different stages, to get to the moon faster. A journey to the moon can be done in different ways, using less fuel and spending more time. Or using more fuel and arriving faster. So far the record for reaching the moon fastest is held by Apollo 8, in only 2 days and 20 hours. Apollo 13 could arrive in the same time, or even sooner. It was a curious coincidence that Apollo 13 was commanded by James Lovell Jr., who also piloted the Apollo 8 command module. It was also curious that one of the astronauts on this mission was replaced by another one, because it was suspected that he might be ill. But in fact, he was never really sick. Or that the original mission was planned for March 12, but was moved to April, to allow more time for planning, according to NASA. It is believed that Apollo 13 was meant to fly slowly to the moon, by inertia, not forcing the engines. But we see the needed extra fuel was really used to increase speed needed to ensure they would land by the Sea of Tranquility sooner. We deduce their need to get there in a short time, by April 13th, was due to when the phase of the moon would be the same as it was on July 20th, 1969, during Apollo 11 arrival. Let's compare in this figure the landing sites of Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. A quick mission of Apollo 13 would allow for it to arrive by April 13th. We notice the moon phase is the same on July 20th, 1969 and April 13th, 1970. This would suggest the elevation of the Sun above the horizon on the Sea of Tranquility was very similar to what it was when Apollo 11 should have landed. In this way, any photo or video taken of this region during the Apollo 13 mission would look real, as if it had been taken during the Apollo 11 mission, which would not have been possible if the Sun was higher or lower. Should the casting of shadows have been too short or too long on the lunar surface, the hoax would have been revealed. The different vertical position of the Sea of Tranquility in the figure is due to a phenomenon called lunar libration. 11.
Houston, we have a problem.
On April 13, 1970, 2 days and 8 hours after liftoff, Apollo 13 reported a problem. We think nothing actually happened. Perhaps it was already very close to land or it was already on the moon's surface. They descended into the Sea of Tranquility, and landed on the Moon at the Apollo 11 site. There was not much time to lose. As Billy Meier told us, it was a quick mission conducted by Apollo 13. The astronauts quickly installed the same equipment and instruments that Apollo 11 carried before. They walked around leaving footprints. They took several photos and videos. These images, photos, and videos are later released by NASA as if they were from Apollo 11, when they were in fact taken by the Apollo 13 crew. It appears that the famous video showing Armstrong and Aldrin descending and walking on the lunar surface, which was transmitted globally on July 20, 1969, was clearly a fake, filmed in a recording studio. We can see how the Moon's horizon is tilted about 13 degrees, and appears to be curved. The explanation given by NASA was that the outer camera of the lunar module was tilted. But, this could not be true because the astronauts are clearly seen walking vertically in the video. If the position of the camera's horizon was tilted, so too would have been the astronaut's standing position been tilted. Other photos and videos, we also deduce, were taken by Apollo 13, whilst at the Sea of Tranquility, where the horizon is seen to be flat, and not with a slope. Perhaps when they recorded the video at the training center, the one that the Apollo 11 astronauts transmitted, pretending it was really happening, was made by simulating a sloped, not a flat terrain. This video showing the moment when they plant the US flag seems real. It is similar to the moment and the astronauts raise the flag on the Apollo 17 mission. The flag moves in a similar way. And the astronauts' boots spread lunar dust that falls away from them. That effect is not reproducible with Earth's sand. With lower gravity, like on the Moon, the dust falls farther away than it would on Earth. The video of the flag raising on Apollo 11, that we watch today was probably taken on Apollo 13. Over time, NASA has changed some of the fake studio footage taken during the Apollo 11 training, and mixed them with the actual Apollo 13 videos and photos. And in this video, we see a horizontal terrain, somehow flat and not tilted, not the same as the video recorded in the studio. Further, we understand the astronauts were meant to use the same camera equipment for recording the latter descent, as well as the raising of the US flag. But in reality, we have two cameras that are not the same. One of them would be on the Moon's surface, during the Apollo 13 mission, and the other in the recording studio. All cameras have characteristics depending on their internal mechanisms and type of lens. When we watch the video of the setting of the flag, we can detect a few ghost images or bright objects. For example, here we see a ghostly-looking astronaut walking in the Moon. The position of the ghostly-looking image is symmetrical to the camera central line. We also see another ghostly-looking image of the bright reflection of one of the lunar module's landing leg. But we do not see these ghost images in the clip showing Armstrong and Aldrin descending and walking around the lunar module. We can see that at some point, the astronauts are illuminated by the sun, but we do not find these ghostly-looking images in this Apollo 11 video. We conclude these are two different cameras. We think current videos, showing the activities, conducted on the Moon during Apollo 11 mission, have a mixture of images recorded in the studio, and images from Apollo 13. This deduction explains why we see a sloped terrain, and not a flat horizon. Because of lack of ghostly-looking images in the Apollo 11 NASA video, showing the astronauts descending for the alleged first moon surface landing walk, and the sloped terrain, we deduce it could not have been recorded at the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. We do ponder why they haven't replaced the famous fake video of Armstrong and Aldrin descending from the Apollo 11 ladder with a better one from Apollo 13. We deduce a possible reason is that they don't have an equivalent good quality video recorded of that exact moment. Another possible reason could be that countless people have already observed that historic moment of the first step on the moon, and many people could have made their own recording of this event. This would have made it problematic to change the fake video, as it could have exposed the hoax. The Apollo 13 astronauts, after leaving all the equipment and footprints in the Sea of Tranquility, quickly returned in their spacecraft to Earth. They simulated the entire process of recovering from the supposed damage to the spacecraft, which never occurred. As they approached Earth, and detached from the command module, to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, we assumed they might have remotely detonated a small explosive charge, which damaged the side of the service module. They took a picture of it from the capsule as evidence of the damage. Then they splashed down safely in the ocean. What most likely followed for the Apollo 13 astronauts was a similar drug-induced hypnosis that also created false memories in their minds to hide the real events. In the Plejaren Contact Report number 231, the extraterrestrial Quetzal mentions that the 4 people responsible for conducting the hypnosis sessions on the Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 astronauts all died accidentally. In the following clip you will find an explanation that Billy gives about the consequences for people that could be considered a threat to the preservation of the hoax.
Und wenn jemand Gefahr bedeuten könnte von diesen Leuten, es sind nur noch eine kleine Handvoll jetzt vorhanden. Wenn die Gefahr bedeuten könnten, dann würden sie einfach durch irgendeinen Unfall sterben.
It is also interesting to find that Billy tells us that Semyatse beamed up Mr. Stullinger, von Braun assistant, to her ship. Billy was there when Semyatse interrogated him. He confessed to them the deception done in the Apollo program. We don't know if Mr. Stullinger recalled later that amazing incident of being beamed up into a Plejaren spaceship. Mr. Stullinger has already passed away. 12. Where are the tapes? In the year 2005, NASA responded to requests from NASA retirees and other interested persons, who were searching for 14 original tapes containing the videos and all the official telemetry of the Apollo 11 voyage. The official response was that they were lost and have never been found. NASA claims the tapes may have been recorded over during other Apollo missions, therefore deleting the original records. It is surprising and suspicious that NASA would lose such vital and historical information about the first ever lunar landing by Apollo 11, which was transmitted to the entire Earth. 13. Apollo landing proof. In the year 2009, the probe Lunar Reconnaissance, whilst in orbit of the Moon, took good resolution photos of several places on the surface, and among them it showed the alleged Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. We see the base of the lunar module, some instruments, and footprints. These images are used to disprove any conspiracy theorists who claim that NASA's Apollo 11 never landed on the Moon. We deduce this image is actually showing us the footprints, instruments, and landing module base left behind by Apollo 13. We trust the information, deductions and conclusions presented here will be evaluated with an open mind, rationally and logically. We hope not to be seen as yet another conspiracy theory, and also hope no subsequent conspiracy theories will suddenly appear that help hide the truth of these facts. These conclusions and deductions are based on revelations made by the Plejaren ETs, who have been contacting Billy Meier for decades. We conclude that it is a true achievement to have reached the moon, and subsequently landing the Apollo 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 and 17 spacecraft on the moon. It was indeed admirable that NASA accomplished these missions with the technology available at that time. We think that the hoax was unnecessary, that the Apollo 11 could have very well been capable of landing successfully on the moon. But perhaps, because of political desires for power, supremacy and the possible fear of failure, fueled the interests of those keen to deceive the world and maintain their advantage. We believe that the Apollo 11 and 13 astronauts themselves were victims of this colossal deception, as well as the entire world population. It is imperative that we as a people finally and completely understand the incredibly important role that mistakes and failures play in our lives. The making of mistakes is a necessary part of an effective and natural learning process. Trying to portray a false image that we cannot fail, or that we are perfect, as in the case of the Apollo 11 hoax, only leads to unnecessary and unpleasant consequences. We must be ready, willing, and allowed to make mistakes in life, so that we can effectively develop the experiential knowledge and wisdom needed for us to evolve. If we do not recognize our errors, we will never learn. Today's materialistic world of man-made laws, politics, religion and systems actually punish mistakes and thus prevent us from learning, growing and ultimately evolving. JFK, in his address before the American Newspaper Association, on April 27, 1961, said, "An error does not become a mistake until you refuse to correct it." The path towards our shared evolution requires the freedom to commit errors, followed by a correction of the behavior towards the better and the good. We all have the same inner drive to be what we are born to be: free and independent.